Snow came down in thin, tired strands, more like falling ash than the bright flakes she remembered from childhood, and the mountain road curled beneath her like it wasn't entirely sure it wanted to be found. Mara guided the borrowed sedan around another bend, hands tight on the wheel, wipers dragging a slow rhythm across the windshield. To her right, the drop disappeared into fog. To her left, pines rose like black ribs, their branches heavy with ice. The dashboard heater groaned weakly, doing its best against the cold that had its fingers around everything. In the back seat, her daughter slept curled around a threadbare backpack, cheeks flushed from the chill, lips moving with half-formed words only she could hear. In the rearview mirror, Mara watched her breathe, counting the rise and fall like it was the only stable rhythm she had. In the front passenger seat, a German shepherd lay with his head between his paws, eyes open and alert, despite the slow sway of the car. His fur was a rough patchwork of tan and black, one ear notched at the tip, a faint white scar tracing a line above his left eye. He watched the trees, the turns, the shifting light, the way only an animal who had lived too close to danger for too long could. When the engine faltered, just for a heartbeat, his ears twitched, and his gaze flicked to her face. "Easy, Ranger," she murmured, more for herself than for him. "We are almost there." The word almost had lost its power months ago after too many almost jobs, almost rooms, almost chances, but this time something in the air felt different, like the mountain itself was listening. The letter lay folded on the passenger side floor, creased so many times the edges had started to fray. She knew every word by now. The law firm's logo at the top. The expression "condolences over the passing of your uncle," as if condolences could patch the holes he'd left. The surprise. "You have been named sole heir to the property known as the Larson Cabin at Blue Hollow Ridge. Report within 14 days to sign the transfer, or the estate will revert to the state." She had stared at that line in the shelter's fluorescent light while her daughter slept on a thin mattress beside her. The hum of other people's whispered arguments and muffled sobs filling the room. An inheritance. From a man she barely remembered, a brother her mother had stopped mentioning long before the bottle took the rest of her stories. Mara's memories of him were blurry. A tall figure who smelled like pine and engine oil. A laugh that came rarely, but felt huge when it did. A rough hand ruffling her hair on one foggy Thanksgiving before he disappeared into the mountains and letters stopped coming. Her mother had called him stubborn, difficult, obsessed with old nonsense about land and ancestors. But when the notice came months after her mother's quiet hospital death and the final eviction and the last locked shelter door, the name at the bottom of the paper, Ole Larson, might as well have been a rope thrown down a well. She had grabbed it with everything she had left. The car finally punched through the last wall of fog, and there it was, a weather-worn wooden sign, half buried in snow on the side of the road. Blue Hollow Ridge. Private access. Beyond it, a narrow track led into darker pines, two faint grooves where tires had pressed through before the storm. Mara pulled over, turned off the engine, and let the sudden silence wrap around them. No city sirens, no shelter announcements, no highway hiss, only the hush of snow, the distant creak of branches and the low thud of her own pulse in her ears. Ranger lifted his head and stared out at the sign, tail twitching once. "Yeah," she said softly. "This is it." She woke her daughter with gentle fingertips. "Lena, hey, we're here." The girl blinked herself up from sleep, brown eyes clouded, hair escaping from under a knitted hat that had seen better winters. "Is this the house?" "Not yet, but close." Mara climbed out, boots crunching into unplowed snow, and inhaled the sharp cold, letting it burn the last traces of exhaust from her lungs. She walked ahead a few steps, testing the depth of the drift. It came up halfway to her knees. Manageable, if slow. Behind her, the car door opened and shut. Ranger jumped down, shaking once, then pointed his nose into the wind, tasting every scent carried on it. Lena wrapped her coat tighter, shivering, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there in months. "Is it really ours?" she asked. Mara looked at the track winding into the trees. Ours. The word felt too big in her mouth. "That's what the letter said," she answered carefully. "For now, we just know it's somewhere we can sleep without anyone telling us to move along." That alone felt like a miracle. She strapped the small duffel over her shoulder, took Lena's hand, and started up the track. Snow whispered around them with each step. The pines closed in, their trunks rising like columns, the sky a smudged gray ribbon overhead. Somewhere far off, a bird shrieked, a harsh, ragged sound quickly swallowed by the wind. Ranger padded in front, stopping now and then to check the air, then moving on when he found nothing he didn't already expect. Deer, fox, stale gasoline, old smoke. The path curved and climbed. Mara's breath puffed in short, careful bursts. Her legs burned, but the ache felt clean, purposeful, not the helpless exhaustion of walking aimlessly from one "no vacancy" sign to the next, but the pain of going toward something, even if she didn't yet know what that something was. After what felt like both 10 minutes and an hour, the trees thinned and the cabin came into view. It sat on a slight rise, its dark logs half buried in snow. A stone chimney leaning at an angle that made her worry and hope in equal measure. The roof wore a heavy cap of white. One shutter hung crooked. Porch wrapped around the front, its railing weathered but intact. For a moment, she just stood there. Lena's hand small and tight in hers, Ranger quiet beside her. Adrift for so long, her mind had almost forgotten how to process the idea of a structure that belonged to her, however, temporarily. It looked tired, she thought, like a person at the end of a long shift who could still stand if someone just told them they weren't alone. "It's kind of like the cabins in those movies," Lena breathed. "Only colder." "And older," Mara added, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Something loosened between her ribs. Not joy, not yet. But maybe the place they kept joy in storage. She climbed the porch steps, wood creaking under her weight, and reached for the doorknob. It turned too easily. The door swung inward with a soft groan. Her first thought wasn't warmth or gratitude. It was a small, sharp alarm bell. Doors on empty mountain cabins weren't supposed to be unlocked. Ranger's body changed in a breath. His relaxed trot condensed into a tight coil of muscle, head low, ears forward, nose cutting the air in quick, short pulls. A growl rolled out of him, low and almost inaudible, vibrating through the boards under her boots. "Stay behind me," Mara whispered, placing an arm across Lena's chest. She stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke long gone cold. Old pine, and something else. A faint metallic tang, like wet nails or pennies between teeth. Light seeped in through grimy windows, painting the narrow room in muted grays. Furniture sat where one might expect it. A table, 3 mismatched chairs, a sagging couch beside a stone hearth. A shelf of books leaned against one wall, titles faded. At first glance, it looked like a place abandoned in a hurry. Then her eyes caught the details. A drawer half open, tracks in the dust around it. A mug shattered on the floor near the sink. Shards swept roughly into a corner with a boot. A set of prints on the wood by the back window, darker and more recent than the rest. Someone had leaned there with wet gloves or unclean hands, staring out. Ranger padded forward silently, sniffing the floorboards. His fur bristled along his spine. He moved to the hearth, then to the bedroom door on the left. Nose, sniff, pause. No fresh human scent. Whoever had ransacked the place wasn't still here. Mara relaxed by degrees, though the unease never fully left. Homelessness had trained her to read spaces as if they had faces. This one wore the same pinched expression she'd seen on people who'd just received bad news and were pretending they hadn't heard it yet. "Mom?" Lena whispered, hovering on the threshold. "Is somebody here?" "Not now," she said, "but someone was." She didn't add, "recently." Instead, she led Lena inside and gently shut the door behind them, feeling the weight of the wood under her palm, the simple solidity of a barrier that wasn't made of glass or revolving steel. "First things first," she said, hearing her own voice settle into a calm she didn't quite trust. "We find the wood stove, check the fireplace, make sure nothing's going to fall on our heads. Warm up." They moved through the cabin slowly. The bedroom held a narrow bed covered in a thick wool blanket, an old trunk, a set of hooks with an oilskin coat still hanging there, as if its owner meant to come back before the weather changed. The small bathroom was basic, but functional, the pipes groaning when she tested the tap. Cold water sputtered out, a small miracle. In the kitchen, she found a few cans on a shelf, a box of matches, a worn photograph tucked behind a jar. She lifted it carefully. Her uncle, younger than she remembered, stood in front of this very cabin, snow piled high around his boots. His face was lined even then, beard thick, eyes narrowed as if the sun hurt. Beside him stood a woman she didn't know, hair braided, expression calm, and at their feet, a dog lay sprawled, some kind of shepherd mix, ears up, gaze directed at whoever held the camera. Behind them, the mountains rose, vast and indifferent. Someone had written on the bottom edge in ink, faded to gray. "We keep what they forgot." Mara stared at the words until the letters blurred. "What were you keeping up here, Ole?" she murmured. Ranger nudged her hand, his nose bumping the photo. "You see him too." "Huh?" she whispered. "You'd have liked each other. Maybe." By late afternoon, a fire crackled stubbornly in the hearth, its heat slowly shouldering the cold back into the corners. Lena sat wrapped in the wool blanket, blowing into a steaming mug of broth made from one of the ancient cans, cheeks pink, eyes shining in the firelight. Ranger lay at her feet, head on his paws, every inch the guard who finally had walls to patrol. Mara sat on the floor, near the fire, legs stretched out, palms extended to the heat until the ache in her fingers began to thaw. Outside, the light faded into a blue-gray that matched the mood in her chest. For the first time in months, her body wasn't braced to be told to leave. That alone made her want to sleep for a week. but the question of the disturbed cabin sat in her mind like a stone in a shoe. She turned the photograph over again, tracing the faded words. "We keep what they forgot." The phrase clung to her. "Mom," Lena said softly, breaking her reverie. "Do you think he wanted us to come?" Mara looked up. The girl's gaze was serious in that way children's eyes sometimes were, as if they saw the edges of things adults pretended weren't there. "I think he left this place for someone who needed it," she said carefully. "Maybe he didn't know it would be us, but we're here now." "Maybe he knew," Lena said, almost to herself. Before Mara could respond, Ranger lifted his head sharply, ears pricking toward the window. A low noise rumbled in his throat. Not a full growl, more like an engine turning over. Mara stilled. Outside, through the muffled hush of snow and wind, came a sound she hadn't heard since they left the main road. The crunch of tires on frozen gravel. She rose slowly, heart thudding, and crossed to the window. Through the warped glass, she saw headlights cut through the trees. Then the square shape of a dark SUV pulling into the clearing, snow hissing under its wheels. It stopped just beyond the porch. The engine idled. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, bundled in a sleek dark parka that didn't look like it came from any store up here. He scanned the cabin with the flat, efficient gaze of someone used to assessing risk. Another door opened. A second figure emerged. Then a third. No one carried tools or groceries. One of them carried a metal case. Mara's fingers tightened around the window frame. Ranger stood now, body a silent question mark. "Mom?" Lena whispered from the fire. "Who is it?" Mara watched the men walk toward the porch, their boots crushing the nearly untouched snow. Their coats bore a neat emblem on the chest, something official-looking, all sharp lines and neutral colors, accompanied by a line of text she could just make out when they passed under the weak light of the porch lantern. Cultural Heritage Recovery Unit. The words should have been reassuring. They weren't. Something about the way they moved, like they were sweeping a room before entering it, made every survival instinct she had flare awake. She stepped away from the window, pulse quickening, and Ranger moved with her, keeping himself between her and the door. A knock sounded. 3 firm raps that weren't asking permission so much as announcing presence. Lena flinched. Mara took a breath, smoothed her expression, and opened the door just enough to see the man on the other side. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And in that instant, with the wind pitching snow around his shoulders and the mountains listening, she understood something simple and terrifying. Whoever had rummaged through her uncle's things before she arrived hadn't given up. They had just decided to try the direct approach. The man on the porch waited with a stillness that didn't belong to the mountains. Wind tugged at the hood of his parka, flinging loose snow across the railing, but he didn't flinch. Mara breathed once, twice, trying to calm the tremor in her voice before she opened the door wider, Ranger pressing against her thigh like a living shield. The man's gaze flicked down to the dog, then back up to her, his smile thinning. "Evening," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "Apologies for the late visit. Weather makes it hard to keep a schedule." Mara kept her body angled in the doorway, blocking his view of Lena. "Can I help you?" The man nodded once in a gesture that was almost polite. Almost. "We're with the Cultural Heritage Recovery Unit," he said, tapping the emblem on his jacket. "We received a notice that this property changed hands recently, and that the inheritor might not be aware of the cabin's significance." The pause before significance felt deliberate, measured, like bait. Mara didn't take it. "I received a letter about the inheritance," she said. "I haven't seen anything else." The man nodded, but his eyes searched the cabin behind her with the slow sweep of someone looking for exits, hiding places, weak points. "Your uncle was a caretaker of sorts," he continued. "The land around here has historical relevance, including unmarked ancestral sites. We've been monitoring the area for several months due to reports of unauthorized digging." Mara's stomach tightened. Unauthorized digging. Someone, not them. Before she could respond, the second man approached the porch, carrying the metal case. His breath fogged in front of him, but he looked at her with the cold focus of someone doing a job with no emotional investment. The third man hung back near the SUV, scanning the tree line. Everything about them was wrong. Too coordinated, too familiar with threat, too unbothered by the isolation. "Ms. Larson?" the lead man asked softly, and the name hit her like a slap. She hadn't introduced herself. He noticed her flinch and smiled. "Small town," he added. "Word travels." That wasn't how small towns worked. Ranger's growl rumbled louder, vibrating through her bones. The man's eyes flicked to him again, calculating. "We'd appreciate a few minutes of your time. There are items that may have been left on the property, maps, notebooks, things your uncle documented. It's important for public safety that we recover them." Public safety. Another word meant to cushion a threat. Mara tightened her grip on the door. "If there's something dangerous, I'll turn it over, but I'm not opening the cabin to strangers." Something behind the man's expression shifted. Not anger, but interest. Curiosity edged with annoyance. "Of course," he said. "We understand the hesitation." He held her gaze for a beat too long, then motioned to the man with the metal case. "We'll give you space to settle in. Weather's bad enough without us making it worse." It sounded like a line he used often, a script. The man with the case didn't move. Neither did the one by the SUV. Finally, the leader added, more sharply, "We're leaving." That worked. The others moved. They walked back to the vehicle, boots crunching, breath sharp in the cold. The SUV door slammed. The engine started. Lights swung across the clearing as the vehicle backed up, turning slowly, then disappeared down the winding road. Mara closed the door, leaned her forehead against the wood, exhaled. She felt Ranger's nose nudge her hip. She sank to her knees and wrapped her arms around his neck, letting her breath steady in the familiar scent of fur and pine and cold air. Behind her, Lena whispered, "Mom, are they bad men?" Mara swallowed hard. "I don't know," she answered truthfully, "but they're not here to help us." The rest of the evening moved slowly, her nerves stretched thin as wire. She checked every window latch twice. She stacked more wood by the fire. She made a bed for Lena on the couch, tucking the girl under the wool blanket. Ranger patrolled the cabin with silent pause, stopping at the door every few minutes to listen, ears flicking. When Mara finally lay down on the floor near the fire, exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, but her mind refused to let go. Something in the cabin hummed with a quiet tension, as if the walls themselves remembered the men who had leaned over drawers and shelves before she arrived, searching. She drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, until Ranger snarled. Her eyes snapped open. The cabin was dark except for the dying glow of embers. Ranger stood rigid by the window, teeth bared, hackles raised, paws planted. Not a dream. Something was outside. Mara's pulse roared in her ears. She crawled to Lena, who slept with her small hand curled under her cheek, and moved her gently without waking her, tucking her further behind the couch. Ranger growled again, low, quieter this time, like he didn't want to alert whatever was out there. Mara crept to the window. Frost blurred the glass, but she could see a faint movement near the tree line, a shape breaking the stillness. A figure. Watching the cabin. Too far to see details. Close enough to know it was no animal. A second shape moved behind the first, then both disappeared into the deeper shadows of the pines. She stayed crouched long after the forest swallowed them. Her breath came shallow, but Ranger didn't bark. He just stood beside her, body tense but controlled, like he understood the importance of silence. Hours crawled by before dawn, finally bled into the sky. The forest shifted from ink black to blue-gray to muted white. Exhaustion hollowed her out, but she forced herself to move through the morning motions, rekindling the fire, heating water, checking the cabin's perimeter from each window. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints visible from this angle. No broken branches. But that didn't mean the men hadn't been there. Lena woke slowly, blinking up at her mother with groggy confusion. "Why are you dressed? Did something happen?" Mara kept her voice soft. "Just couldn't sleep. First night in a new place." Lena nodded, still half asleep. But Ranger didn't rest. He paced near the door, gaze fixed on the porch, ears high. Mara set a hand on his back. "We're not leaving," she whispered. "Not unless we have to." She meant the words, but fear seeped through them like melted snow through cloth. She needed answers. This cabin wasn't just a forgotten family relic. Her uncle hadn't simply come here to escape. He'd been guarding something. Something that strangers were willing to come into the mountains for during a storm. Something he had hidden well enough that they hadn't found it. We keep what they forgot. The phrase burned in her thoughts. She waited until Lena finished eating a small breakfast and settled with a borrowed book from the shelf, then pulled on her coat and stepped outside with Ranger, leaving the door cracked so she could hear if Lena called. The morning air cut through her clothes, sharp and metallic. Ranger trotted ahead, nose to the snow, tail low but steady. "Show me," she murmured. Ranger circled the clearing twice, then stopped near the back of the cabin. He lowered his head and sniffed deeply. His paw scraped the snow, revealing a faint impression beneath, boot prints, partially filled in by falling snow but still visible. Ranger followed the trail to the edge of the trees and stopped, staring into the forest. The prints continued into the pines, where the snow lay deeper and the light thinned. Mara's breath tightened. They had stood here, watching, waiting. She stepped back carefully and returned to the cabin before Lena noticed her absence. By noon, the clouds had darkened, promising another storm. Mara used the last few moments of clear light to search the cabin more thoroughly. Ranger followed, tail flicking, nose leading them through every room. In the small bedroom, she opened the trunk at the foot of the bed. Clothes, blankets, A bundle of letters tied with twine. Maps. Handwritten notes in a cramped script. Ranger nudged the maps, snuffling at them with a sudden intensity. Mara unrolled one across the bed. It was old, edges cracked, the ink faded but legible. The map detailed the mountain ridge, but not as a hiker or land surveyor would draw it. No, it was marked with symbols, circles, triangles, small runes she didn't recognize. Lines connected them in a pattern that made no logical sense until she tilted her head and followed Ranger's nose. One symbol was circled twice and labeled in her uncle's handwriting. Jertit I Snoen. Mara whispered the words aloud. Hier, Tet. Isnuen. Ranger's ears perked at her voice. She pulled her phone from her pocket. No signal, of course, but an offline Norwegian dictionary app she'd downloaded months ago for Lena's school project still worked. She typed the phrase, "Heart in the snow." A shiver whispered up her spine. Ranger pawed the paper lightly, nose moving along the connecting lines until he reached a second mark, a square symbol, smaller than the rest. Next to it, her uncle had written one word, protect. Mara's heart hammered. What were you guarding? She whispered. Ranger leaned closer, nudging the corner of the map again. Something beneath the trunk creaked softly. Mara moved it aside. Underneath, one floorboard sat slightly raised, its edge uneven. She slid her fingers under the board and pried it up. Beneath lay a small wooden box, carved with symbols that matched the map. Cold air rushed out when she opened it, as if whatever was inside had been holding its breath. Inside lay a key, old, heavy, iron, but more than a key. Its handle was shaped like a stylized wolf's head, eyes hollow, teeth bared. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a note in her uncle's hand. If you are reading this, I am gone. There are those who will come for what lies beneath the mountain. Do not trust their uniforms. Do not trust their words. Keep the key safe. The rest of the message was smudged, the ink blurred as if someone had tried to wipe it clean. Mara stared at the words until her pulse steadied into a cold determination. The men weren't done. They would return. And whatever lay beneath the mountain, whatever her uncle had guarded all these years, she had just inherited its burden. She closed the box. Ranger pressed his forehead to her knee, letting out a low, steady breath. I know, she whispered, stroking his fur. We don't run this time. Behind her, the floorboards creaked softly. Lena's footsteps. Mom, what's wrong? Mara stood slowly, turning toward her daughter with the box hidden behind her back and a steadying breath filling her lungs. We're going to be okay, she said, but we're not alone up here. The words hung in the air, fragile and cold. And somewhere beyond the trees, she knew the men in dark parkas were already planning their next move.